dressing in ways that mark you out for being of this or that caste, right? Make sure that you, in your sartorial or in your bodily comportment, in what you wear and how you live, you conduct yourself with dignity and confidence, right? Stop practicing rituals and stop believing in superstitions which have come down to you through your religion, through your caste, through your community, and take charge of your families, right? Refuse to have too many children, refuse to marry your children at a very young age, educate your children, right? Make sure that you treat girl children alike as male children. In other words, he tried to address women as mothers and as the initiators of social change within their families, within their communities. And this is something really very important and very ahead of its times. Because you are not seeing this. There's a great deal of social reform, there's a great deal of political and economic churning in this period in the 1930s and 40s during the anti-colonial struggles in India. And there are a number of very important men and women who are leading these struggles. But Ambedkar was really ahead of his times in talking about women's equality in these terms, right? And he went to address the All India Women's Depressed Classes Women's Conferences, and he in turn said that not only was it important for them that he addressed them, he himself said that he was deeply affected by this sight of thousands of women who gathered to hear him and who were interested in social and economic change, and who came out of their homes and their families to try to improve their lot and that of their families and their communities. At this point, in the early 1940s, during the Quit India movement and all, Ambedkar also started to think very carefully about the prospect of partition and the formation of Pakistan. And he wrote a book about the prospect of partition, again, well ahead of 1946-47, when it became clear that partition was actually going to happen. And in that book, which he wrote initially in 1940, then he modified it in 42, then again throughout the later part of the 1940s, not only was he open to the idea that Muslims in the South Asian homeland might need to think about their own country, right? So he was open to the idea of partition in various ways. But he also talks about the condition of Muslim women, right? So in other words, he's not only thinking about women as untouchable women or as Hindu women within the purview of the caste system, he also comments on the condition of Muslim women, and he notes that although Islam is an egalitarian religion, and although it has, better ideas about gender justice than the caste system within Hinduism, nonetheless, practices like polygamy, like burqa, like parda, rules around talaq or divorce implicitly disempower Muslim women. And in many ways, Muslim women are even more oppressed, he notes, at that time than their Hindu low-caste sisters. And he notes that this is an irony given the emancipatory and kind of liberative potential that is actually present within Islam. Right? So he says again, just as Hindu society has certain social conventions and customs which are deeply hierarchical, deeply patriarchal and thoroughly disempowering for women, so also Muslim society is no better as far as the condition of women in India is concerned, India or potentially Pakistan. So he makes a note of that, and he has the courage to do that even while thinking about the pros and cons of partition. In 1946-47, Ambedkar becomes a part of the Constituent Assembly of India, which has been called to create the Constitution, to write the Constitution, and eventually he becomes the chairman of the drafting committee of the Constitution. And the Constitution, as you know, thanks to his influence, but also that of other leaders, is a thoroughly egalitarian document. Right? It talks about equal citizenship for men and women. It talks about equal rights. It talks about fundamental rights, and it offers various kind of protections to minorities and weaker communities of various kinds, including to women. But there is a fundamental problem within the Constitution as far as women's rights are concerned, because on the one hand, the Constitution upholds equal citizenship and equal rights for men and women. So gender is not a basis for discrimination. But the Constitution also grants freedom of religion and creates a regime of personal laws wherein each religion is allowed to protect its own customs, traditions and practices without interference from the state, right? So there's no imposition of an overall law as regards religion or secularism or atheism and so on. So the minute you allow freedom of religion, within each religion there can continue to be practices which are essentially unequal as far as women are concerned. And this is something that Ambedkar could perceive, right? That we have an egalitarian constitution, but the principle of citizenship is contradicted by, this principle of the freedom of religion, which on the one hand is a good principle, right? Because it gives equal rights to all religions. But what happens within those religions as far as women's rights are concerned is something which the state then does not, want to interfere in. And this is a problem which we have seen continuing up to the present time. It was something which was highlighted very much during the Shah Bano case in the late 1980s, and it continues to come up from time to time, that within personal law regimes, whether they are Hindu or Muslim or Christian or any other, there can be practices which are essentially, which are not good for women. So Ambedkar, from the very beginning, had said that as far as Hinduism is concerned, the real problem is not so much untouchability. The real problem of the caste system is not so much the problem of untouchability, although that is a huge problem, right? And that is something which was done away with once the constitution was put in place. The real problem is that the caste system persists on the basis of endogamy, right? That is to say, you must always marry within your caste. There is no intermarriage across castes or across religion that is allowed by the caste system. And this is the root of women's inequality, right? Because there is no exit from the caste system, right? There is no mobility within the caste system. There is no diversity that is allowed within the society. So the real root of the problem is this lack of a space for intermarriage, right, within the caste system. And Ambedkar put these two things together, right, the problems of untouchability and endogamy within the caste system, within the Hindu religion, plus this kind of caveat within the constitutional idea of equal citizenship, which is the freedom of religion, right? And after the constitution was created and India became independent and a new government was formed, he accepted the position of the first law minister in Nehru's cabinet in 1950. And his main agenda when he was law minister was to propose what he called the Hindu Code Bill. And the Hindu Code Bill was to be a piece of legislation which would essentially reform the Hindu religion, right, from within, in terms of rules of marriage, rules of divorce, rules of property, rules of inheritance, practices like widow remarriage, dowry, child marriage, abortion, freedom to choose whom you want to marry and so on. All this entire range of issues, right? He said that Hindu religion is like a dilapidated house. It's like a decrepit house, right? So if either you want to completely demolish it and start anew, right? This was his theory of the annihilation of caste. But since Hindus are not willing to do that, then they must at least fix their broken house before they can live in it, right? So it's important to reform society if you are not willing to rebuild it from scratch, right? And in his capacity as a law minister, he created this very progressive, very forward-looking Hindu Code Bill, which was designed not just for untouchables or for lower castes or depressed castes or for Shudras or for Dalits. It was designed for all Hindus, right? And it wanted to rationalize and reform traditional customs and laws and practices within Hindu personal law to render them more modern, right? And in this, I'm sorry to say that he completely failed, right? Because other members of the Constituent Assembly, other parliamentarians, congressmen, and even at the time the President of India, Rajendra Prasad, put their foot down and said, this is too radical, right? We don't need this kind of legislation. We have to think about gradual change, or we have to think about different ways of addressing social inequality, but this is not going to go forward. And Nehru, who had been very, very supportive of Ambedkar, who had brought Ambedkar in with the intention that together they would pass this bill, failed to get any support from his fellow congressmen. And the first elections were coming up in 1951, and there was a great fear that basically they would lose, the Congress would lose the elections, even though there was no serious opposition at the time, because of this Hindu Code bill. So Nehru allowed it to drop. Under pressure from the President, Rajendra Prasad, Nehru allowed it to drop. And Ambedkar was outraged. He was completely furious. And he resigned from the government. He resigned his position from as law minister. And he wrote this long tract where he said, you know, that this is so disappointing, not only in terms of political, economic and social reform and change, but also in terms of his own understanding of the promises that Nehru had made to him and of the agenda that they had set out to carve together, which included a big component of which was change for women and for the rights of women. So at this point, Ambedkar kind of withdrew from national politics, and he contested elections, and you know, he actually lost the election, but then he was brought in through the Rajya Sabha. So you see, the point is that there was a great deal of pervasive resistance to his ideas, right? And he had gone so far as to put these things into the constitution, but he was still not able to create the actual change on the level at which he had imagined would become possible once India became independent. Right? And even somebody like Nehru, who himself was, you know, very progressive and in many ways suspicious of religions and their, you know, internal dynamics, even he was not able to carry the day with the rest of his party and the rest of his colleagues and others in politics. So in a sense, orthodoxy won out. Over time, different aspects of the proposed Hindu Code Bill legislation were passed piecemeal, right, through different bills, through different acts in Parliament. But the kind of reform overall that Ambedkar had envisaged, especially as regards women, was never able to be fully realized and has not been realized even to this day, partly because this principle of personal laws and the personal law regimes and the freedom of religion still remains a cornerstone of our constitution, along with equal citizenship for men and women. Right? That contradiction, in a sense, has not been resolved. Finally, you know, in the last 5-6 years of his life, Ambedkar died in 1956. He went back to the speech which he had made in 1935, where he said, "I will not die a Hindu," and he started to think about that. So, you know, does that mean he will convert to a different religion? And which religion will that be? And by this time, he had had time to engage with, you know, and think deeply about Christianity, about Sikhism, about Islam, and leaders of these different religious groups had approached him and said, "Why don't you join us? Right? Why don't former untouchables, now called Dalits, why don't they join us? And our religion will give you the space which Hinduism and caste society never gave you. They will give you the dignity, they will give you the equality." But having considered all the options, he eventually decided that he wanted to become a Buddhist, and he wanted other untouchables to join him in becoming Buddhists. And he had various reasons for this. He felt that Buddhism, as propounded by the Buddha, by Gautam Buddha, 2500 years ago, had always been a form of protest against Vedic caste society, right? So he wanted to embrace a whole tradition of protesting against caste Hinduism, right, by embracing Buddhism, which he felt was the very first form of the rejection of the caste system that is available within Indian history. He also had a theory that people had converted to Buddhism in very large numbers in ancient India, but over time, those Buddhists had been defeated by Brahmins and by caste Hindus and enslaved and rendered as untouchables, right? So in other words, the untouchables of today were actually the Buddhists of ancient India, and they had over time been reduced to this position because of the power of caste society. So if untouchables were now to again become Buddhists, in a sense they would be returning to their original identity as Buddhists. This was his theory of history, and he put it forward in a number of books that he wrote, in a number of speeches that he gave, in a number of articles that he wrote, that we were Buddhists, we were rendered as broken men, and our position in society was made worse than that of slaves, and now we will re-embrace Buddhism and regain our dignity and our position as separate from and completely against the idea of caste Hinduism. So in 1956 he organized a major mass conversion, which is the first such conversion in the history of Buddhism in the world, in Nagpur. And it's interesting that he chose Nagpur because Nagpur is also, as you know, the seat of Hindu nationalism and the place where the RSS was born. About 500,000 untouchables showed up in October 1956, and he conducted this mass conversion ceremony where people took Buddhist vows, which he had written specially, and he became a Buddhist of the new school of Buddhism, which he called the Navayana, which means the new kind of Buddhism. So not Hinayana, not Mahayana, not Vajrayana, but Navayana, the new vehicle, the new way of Buddhism. And again, there's a special place for women in this story. Because the traditional Buddhism, as you know, follows the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha, right? So the person of Siddhartha Gautama, who is the Buddha, the Dhamma, which is the Buddhist way, and the Sangha, which is the monastic community of Buddhist monks. Right? These are the three basic vows of Buddhism which every Buddhist traditionally takes the world over. But the Sangha itself is conceived of as a community of monks. And this has got a special status separate from lay people. So ordinary people, householders, are simply called upasaks or upasikas, and members of the Sangha are the bhikshus or the bhikkhunis, right? The monks and the nuns. So Ambedkar said, first of all, not only can you have bhikshus, you should also have bhikkhunis, so monks and nuns. Not only should you have upasaks, you should also have upasikas, that is men and women lay persons, but also that there should be no special status given to monks, to the monastic community, that even lay persons, ordinary Buddhists, because most people are not going to become monks. Most people are not going to take those vows and enter into some kind of monastic community, right? For ordinary people, especially if they are illiterate or they are poor or they are backward or they are untouchables, for them to identify with Buddhism, it has to be open to men and women, it has to be open to ordinary people, and they have to continue in their ordinary life without actually becoming monks and nuns, right? So in a way, he revolutionized the concept of the Buddhist community itself, right? Not only, he said it cannot be restricted to the Sangha, it has to be opened up to everyone, right? And soon after he had announced this new sect and conducted this mass conversion of about 400,000 to 500,000 untouchables on the spot over the course of 2 days, he was very, very sick and he died in early December 1956. And thereafter, the conversions continued over the next few years till the number more or less stabilized at about 4 million. And the community has not necessarily grown much since then. But now again you see, after a long gap of about 40-50 years, a big revival of interest in Ambedkarite Buddhism. And at this point in time, today men and women play an equal role. And I've met many women who consider themselves as Ambedkarite Buddhists, who organize their communities and their families according to the principles of Ambedkarite Buddhism, and who believe in the egalitarianism of this religion, which frees them from all the different kinds of histories of oppression and inequality, which are so much a part of the caste system and of caste and Buddhism. So this is Ambedkar's story as far as women's rights and women's issues are concerned. I just want to say very little bit about Ambedkar's own life. He was, in many ways, he lived through he experienced, he was born into, he lived through, he experienced some of the biggest problems of his own community. Right? He was born a Mahan, which is an untouchable caste in Maharashtra. He was married off at a very young age by his family. He was married to a woman of his own community. She was only 9 years old when they were married. He was about 16 or 17. And he knew what it was. He knew what child marriage meant, right? He knew what it meant for a woman to be completely illiterate or uneducated as his wife was, or for religious beliefs to dominate a woman's life as his own wife's life was. She was very, very religious, very pious. She was not educated. Ambedkar himself became very educated, but his wife was not with him. They couldn't be fellow travelers because that is not what their social conventions and customs allowed. And she bore him 4 children, 3 of whom died. She herself died at a very young age in 1935, and he was left companionless in a sense. So he had seen the condition of women up close, in his own family, in his own marriage. And I think that gave him the energy to address women's issues with a great deal of compassion, but also a great deal of intensity. Later on in his life, around 1948, I think he remarried, and he was at this time already in very bad health. And he married his own doctor. Now it's interesting that his doctor was a Brahmin woman. And when he married her, there was huge opposition. It's interesting, India is independent by this time. He is already a kind of founding father. He is, writing the constitution. But when he decides to marry who he wants to marry, there's a huge uproar. And both within his own community and among others, there was this question: why is he marrying a Brahmin? Is he trying to, rise up in society by marrying a Brahmin woman, and so on and so forth. But the fact of the matter is, he was very close to this doctor of his, and she was with him all the time, and she married him. She changed her name, and she was a true companion to him, and part of the struggle he was trying to articulate through the laws and the legislation and so on that he was writing, it was also being played out in his own personal life, where he exercised the freedom, and so did his wife, in marrying each other. And eventually, along with him, she converted to Buddhism, right? So this Dalit man and his Brahmin wife both converted to Buddhism. They both rejected. And it was very important for the ritual of conversion that he conducted, that she be along with him on the stage in front of those 500,000 people in Nagpur. And they both took those vows together, right? And that was a great example to the community that men and women equally could enter into this new Buddhism, this new community. So in a way, Ambedkar's own life, maps that struggle, right? From this kind of child marriage within his caste, then he starts to theorize the meaning of problems of endogamy and patriarchy, the problems of too much childbearing, the problems that arise when women are not educated, when women cannot work, and he made whatever difference he could in whatever way he could to address these issues, and finally to the point of his conversion, where he was talking about a completely new kind of society in which men and women could be equals. But that society had to be conceived of from scratch, completely apart from and in negating the principles of caste in the society. So this is a story. I mean, I've only given you the bare bones of the narrative, but you know, if you'd like to talk more about anything, we can certainly do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ananya, for a fantastic lecture, simple and clear and going over so much ground and such a long period in our history, such a critical period in our history, so beautifully. I was looking at the faces while you were talking and everyone was absorbing every single point you made, which are still so relevant. I have two questions before I ask the audience to ask you questions. One is that, can you tell us a little bit about Ambedkar's mother? What was she like? Who was she? What was the influence on him? And the other is that about affirmative action. That, you know, as we speak in the budget, there has been some cutback on affirmative action and less money has gone into planned expenditure for on social welfare and the Women Child Scheme. So I just wanted to know what, you know, people keep saying that Ambedkar wanted entitlements and affirmative action just to go on for 10 more years and then after that not. So what would you have thought about this, something like this now?
Ambedkar's mother actually died when he was very, very young. So he was raised by his father and he had other siblings. And actually his father is a very important figure in his life because he's the one he was part of the Mahar regiment in the British Army. And because he was in the army, he was able to send his kids to the schools which are in the army barracks. And they lived in Mau, then they moved to Satara, then they came to Bombay. And all along it was Ambedkar's father who recognized that his youngest child is absolutely brilliant. And it was to educate Ambedkar that they moved from the small village to the small barracks town to the provincial town and then to the big city, so that Ambedkar could be sent to school, where he kept getting scholarships and kept proceeding to higher and higher levels. So he was the first person of his community, you know, to make it through high school, then make it into Elphinstone College in Mumbai, and you know, to get his BA degree. And then he was chosen for a scholarship to go and study abroad at Columbia University, the first person to get a PhD and so on. But all along it was his father who was pushing him, and it was his father who was making sure that he had, you know, the time, the resources, you know, the roof over his head, the food in his stomach, where he could study. And when Ambedkar went to school, you know, he was, you know, caste kids and teachers wouldn't let him sit with them, right? He had to go without water all day because they wouldn't let him drink from the you know, water which other kids were drinking in school. But despite these hardships, he continued to do very well academically, and his father basically supported him, you know, all the way. Now, in 1913 is when Ambedkar left for America. Left for New York, and that same year his father died, right? And this is you know, this was really, I think, a big blow. But in many ways, I mean, I'm writing a biography, so I think in his terms, I mean, you could say his work was done, right? He had already launched Ambedkar to be the person that he was going to be, and that was all done by his father. So his mother, you know, has no. I mean, she just died very early on, so we don't really have any sense of what she might have been for Ambedkar. And he grew up motherless. And actually, he was very close to a number of his teachers, a lot of whom, interestingly, were Brahmins. One of whom gave him his name. That's how he came to be called Ambedkar. Otherwise, his name would not have been Ambedkar, which is a Brahmin name. And also, you know, helped him with scholarships, gave him books. His interest in Buddhism was inspired by one of his teachers, who gave him a book as a prize about the life of the Buddha at age 16. That was his first exposure to the history of Buddhism. On your second question, and also, you know, his wife, although she was present from his age 16 or 17 in his life, you know, could not really be a companion to him for no fault of hers or his, because he went away abroad to study, and he was abroad in England and America for close to 10 years. And she was left behind in Bombay with the family. So they, you know, they were not together in those crucial years of his life when his father had died, and his wife was